The cigarette burned down to the filter, a long, precarious tower of gray ash that defied gravity, much like the man holding it. The room was small, suffocatingly hot, tucked away in the back of a social club on 113th Street. The air didn't move. It hung heavy, thick with the smell of stale bourbon and the metallic, coppery scent of terror. There were 4 men standing in the corners of the room, their hands tucked into their jackets, their eyes wide, darting from the door to the man sitting in the center. They were waiting for the order. They were waiting for the explosion. Because the man sitting across from the desk, a young, ambitious lieutenant from a rival uptown crew, had just done the unthinkable. He had just slammed a loaded .38 revolver on the table, the steel clattering against the wood with a sound that should have been a death sentence. The young man was sweating. Rivulets ran down his temple, staining the collar of his cheap shirt. He was shouting, his voice cracking with the adrenaline of a man who knows he has gone too far to turn back. He was demanding territory. He was demanding a cut of the numbers. He was waving the gun, screaming that the old ways were dead, that the streets belonged to the strong, to the ones willing to pull the trigger. He was begging for a reaction. He wanted the man in the chair to flinch. He wanted him to reach for a weapon. He wanted the war to start right here, right now, in a blaze of glory that would make him a legend. But the man in the chair didn't move. He didn't look at the gun. He didn't look at the bodyguards in the corners. He stared at the ash on his cigarette, watching it hold its shape, defying the vibration of the young man's shouting. His face was a mask of obsidian, unreadable, calm, terrifyingly still. The silence that emanated from him was louder than the shouting. It swallowed the room. It was the silence of a deep ocean trench, crushing everything under the weight of its pressure. The young man stopped yelling. He gasped for air, the silence choking him. He looked at the gun on the table, then back at the man in the chair, and for the first time he realized his mistake. He realized that the man wasn't afraid of the gun. The man was bored by it. The man in the chair finally moved. He slowly reached out, his hand steady as stone, and stubbed out the cigarette in the overflowing ashtray. The sound of the crushing tobacco was the only noise in the world. He looked up, his eyes heavy, tired, and infinitely dangerous. He didn't pick up the gun. He didn't order his men to kill. He simply reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a fountain pen, and began to write on a napkin. The scratching of the nib was slow, deliberate. Scritch, scratch, scritch. He folded the napkin, slid it across the table past the loaded gun, and spoke for the first time. His voice was a low rumble, barely a whisper. "Go home, son. Your mother is waiting for this." If you're drawn to the untold power stories of Harlem and the men who ruled without noise, you're already in the right place. This is Bumpy Johnson Files. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. The young man looked at the napkin. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a hit order. It was a receipt. A receipt for the overdue rent on his mother's apartment, paid in full 1 hour ago. The young man's knees buckled. The gun on the table suddenly looked like a toy. He had come to start a war with bullets, and he had been defeated by a devastating act of charity. The history books will tell you about the bodies. They will list the shootouts, the gang wars, the violent struggle for control of the Harlem underworld. They are selling you a movie script. The real files, the ones that were never written down but were whispered in the barber shops and the jazz clubs, tell a different story. They tell the story of a man who understood that violence is the tool of the amateur. They tell the story of a king who realized that every time you pull a trigger, you lose a piece of your power. This story isn't about how Bumpy Johnson outfought his enemies. It is about how he outthought them. It is the story of why the most dangerous weapon in Harlem wasn't a machine gun, but a favor. To understand why he chose silence over violence, you have to understand the precipice he stood on every single day. The Harlem of the 1940s and 50s was a pressure cooker. To the south, the Italian families were waiting for any excuse to invade, to turn the neighborhood into a vassal state. To the east, the police were watching, waiting for the chaos that would justify a crackdown. And inside the community, poverty was grinding people down, making them desperate, making them volatile. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a gangster, he was the dam holding back a flood. He sat in his apartment late at night, the city sounds drifting up from the street, and he felt the weight of it. He knew that if he responded to every insult with violence, if he killed every challenger, the streets would run red, the police would descend, the business, the numbers, the protection, the order would collapse. He wasn't afraid of blood. He had shed enough of it to fill a river. He was afraid of chaos. He was afraid of the random, uncontrollable fire that violence starts. He knew that a dead enemy is gone, but a humiliated enemy, a debt-ridden enemy, or a co-opted enemy works for you forever. The strategy began to shift in the winter of 1952. A new crew had moved in from the Bronx, loud men with flashy cars and no respect for the hierarchy. They started robbing the independent numbers runners. They beat up a shopkeeper on 125th Street who refused to pay double protection. The neighborhood was angry. They came to Bumpy, demanding justice. They wanted heads on pikes. They wanted to see the invaders bleed. His lieutenants were in his ear, sharpening their knives. "Let us hit them tonight, Bumpy. We catch them at the club. We wipe them out." It would have been easy. It would have been satisfying. But Bumpy shook his head. "No," he said, staring at the chessboard on his desk. "If we shoot them, the police come. If the police come, the banks close. If the banks close, nobody eats. We don't shoot them. We starve them." He didn't send soldiers. He sent word. It was a whisper campaign, a masterclass in economic warfare. He went to the suppliers who sold the Bronx crew their liquor. He went to the mechanics who fixed their cars. He went to the landlords who owned their safe houses. He didn't threaten these people. He simply made it clear that doing business with the invaders meant not doing business with Harlem. It was slow at first. A delivery truck broke down, and the Bronx crew had no whiskey for the weekend. Then their cars started having tire blowouts that no mechanic was available to fix. Then the heat in their safe house mysteriously went out in the middle of a blizzard, and the repairman was booked until March. It was a tightening noose, invisible and suffocating. The Bronx crew was ready for a gunfight. They were ready to dive behind cars and shoot back, but they weren't ready for the cold. They weren't ready for the silence. The tension escalated when the leader of the Bronx crew, a man named Russo, decided to force the issue. He couldn't fight a ghost, so he decided to make a noise so loud Bumpy would have to answer. He kidnapped a runner, a kid barely 16, and held him in a warehouse by the river. He sent a message, "Come get him, or we send him back in pieces." This was the trap. Russo wanted Bumpy to come with an army. He had the warehouse rigged. He had men in the rafters. He wanted a war, because a war was the only thing he understood. The community held its breath, the mothers prayed, the men checked their weapons, everyone expected the night to explode. Bumpy received the message in the back of the flash-in. He read it, folded it, and placed it in his pocket. His face didn't change, but the air around him dropped 10 degrees. He stood up and put on his coat. "Stay here," he told his men. "All of you."
"You can't go alone," his second-in-command protested. "It's an ambush." "I know," Bumpy said. "That's why I'm not bringing targets." He walked to the warehouse alone. He walked right down the center of the street, under the streetlights, a solitary figure in a long coat. Inside the warehouse, Russo and his men watched him coming. They were confused. Where was the backup? Where were the cars? Why was he walking like a man going to church? They kept their fingers on the triggers, sweating, waiting for the trick. Bumpy reached the heavy iron doors. He didn't kick them. He knocked. Russo, bewildered, ordered the door opened. Bumpy stepped inside, unarmed. He looked at the kid tied to a chair, beat up but alive. Then he looked at Russo. "You have something that belongs to me," Bumpy said. His voice echoed in the vast, empty space. "You came alone to die?" Russo sneered, waving a pistol. "You think you're Superman?" "I came alone because I wanted you to listen, and you can't listen when guns are going off." He took a step forward. The gunmen in the rafters tensed. "You can kill me," Bumpy continued, his voice steady, devoid of fear. "You can kill the boy, but if you do, you have to leave this building, and when you walk outside, look at the rooftops, look at the alleyways, look at the windows." Russo frowned. He signaled one of his men to check the window. The man peered out into the night and turned back, his face pale white. "Boss," he whispered, "they're everywhere."
"Who?" Russo demanded. "Everyone," the man said. "The whole neighborhood. There's 1,000 people out there, just standing, watching." Bumpy hadn't brought a hit squad. He had brought Harlem. He had mobilized the community, not to fight, but to witness. He had surrounded the warehouse with grandmothers, shopkeepers, school teachers, and street hustlers. Thousands of eyes, silently judging, silently recording. "If you shoot," Bumpy said softly, "you don't leave New York. You don't leave this block, not because of me, but because of them. You can't kill a whole city, Russo." The psychological weight of it crushed the room. Russo was a gangster. He was used to fighting other gangsters. He wasn't prepared to fight a community. He looked at the window, then at Bumpy. The gun in his hand felt heavy, useless. The realization washed over him that he had been outmaneuvered on a level he couldn't comprehend. Bumpy hadn't used violence. He had used the threat of total social annihilation. "Take the kid," Russo muttered, lowering the gun. "Just take him and go." Bumpy walked over, untied the boy, and helped him up. He didn't gloat. He didn't say a word. He turned his back on the armed men, the ultimate sign of disrespect and dominance, and walked out the door. As they emerged into the night, the crowd outside didn't cheer. They just parted, creating a path for Bumpy and the boy. It was a silent corridor of respect. That night changed the rules forever. The Bronx crew left the next day. They didn't leave because they were shot out. They left because they were spooked. They told stories about the man who could summon an army without making a phone call. They told stories about the ghost of Harlem who walked through bullets without getting scratched. But Bumpy knew the truth. He knew that night wasn't magic. It was leverage. He had spent years building a bank account of goodwill, of favors, of protection, just so he could spend it in that one moment to save a life without taking one. This approach, violence as the absolute last resort, became his doctrine. When a rival dealer tried to undercut him, Bumpy didn't break his legs. He found out the dealer had a gambling problem and bought his debt from the bookies. He walked into the dealer's office, placed the markers on the table, and said, "You work for me now." The dealer, terrified and relieved, became his most loyal lieutenant. When a politician threatened to crack down on the numbers, Bumpy didn't threaten the politician's life. He found out the politician's daughter needed a specialized surgery that wasn't available in the city. Bumpy paid for the best surgeon in Boston to fly in. The crackdown disappeared, and the politician owed him a life. He realized that killing a man makes him a martyr, but owning a man makes him a tool. Violence is messy. It leaves fingerprints. It leaves ghosts. But leverage is clean. Leverage is quiet. As the years went on, this philosophy became harder to maintain. The 1960s brought a new kind of heat. The drugs got harder. The guns got bigger. The young wolves didn't care about the old codes. They saw Bumpy's restraint as weakness. "The old man is soft," they whispered. "He's afraid to pull the trigger." They didn't understand that he was holding back the tide. There was one final moment near the end that defined this struggle, a meeting with the heads of the 5 families. They were pushing for him to allow heroin distribution near the schools. It was a line Bumpy had drawn in the sand, "Not near the kids," he had always said. The Italians were losing patience. They threatened to sanction a hit. They threatened to burn Harlem down if he didn't step aside. The room was filled with smoke and the smell of expensive cologne masking the smell of rot. The boss of the Genovese family leaned forward. "You're one man, Bumpy. We are an army. You can't stop the flood. Either you open the gates or we wash you away." Bumpy looked at them. He was older now. His hair was gray, but his eyes were still the same deep wells. He didn't shout. He didn't pound the table. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a file. He slid it across the mahogany table. "What is this?" the boss asked. "That," Bumpy said, "is a list of the locations where your trucks stop in Harlem. It's a list of the cops on your payroll who live in my neighborhoods. It's a list of the warehouses you own under shell companies." The boss opened the file. His face went pale. "If you start a war," Bumpy continued, his voice a low hum, "I don't have to win. I just have to make sure you lose everything. I will give this file to the press. I will give it to the feds. I will burn my own house down just to see yours catch fire. Do you want to make money, or do you want to be famous?" The silence that followed was the same silence from the back room years ago. It was the silence of men realizing they were playing checkers while their opponent was playing 4D chess. They realized that Bumpy wasn't protecting his territory with guns. He was protecting it with the threat of mutual destruction. He was the nuclear option. They backed down. The trucks stayed away from the schools. The peace held. Bumpy Johnson walked out of that meeting, his heart pounding, his hands shaking slightly as he buttoned his coat. He knew how close it had been. He knew that the era of the thinking man was ending and the era of the gunman was coming. But for one more day, he had held the line. He died of a heart attack in 1968, sitting in a diner, surrounded by the people he had spent a lifetime protecting and exploiting. There were no bullet holes in him, no knife wounds. He died a natural death in an unnatural world. The legacy he left behind is often misunderstood. People glorify the swagger, the suits, the connection to the mob. But the true lesson of Bumpy Johnson is found in the bullets he didn't fire. It is found in the restraint. He showed that true power isn't about the ability to inflict pain, it's about the ability to absorb pressure and redirect it. He proved that a man who can control his own rage can control the world. In a world that screams for attention, the most powerful person is the one who commands the silence. Bumpy Johnson didn't need to be the loudest man in the room because he knew what the room was made of. He knew that violence is the bankruptcy of the mind. And Bumpy Johnson, he always paid his debts. This is Bumpy Johnson Files. Subscribe for the stories history tried to bury.